there is a significant shift in what we're talking about here. And that is that we stop talking about leaders and we start talking about leadership.
Welcome to the podcast where we try to inspire better work performance. Thanks for listening.
Hey everyone. Today's episode is a continuation of our episode with Torben Nørby. We're going to continue our conversation on culture, but this episode focuses more on the impact of AI and the concept of shared leadership and some of the things that need to change. So stay tuned because it's a great conversation on how culture and organizations are changing in the new environment. This episode is sponsored by Culsure.com, Culsure.com. If you're looking for a comprehensive organizational survey so you can figure out what the heck is going on with your employees, give us a call. Culsure.com, Culsure.com. Hello, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Cindi. I've been looking forward.
Me too. You and I have had great conversations previously. So I'm looking forward to today. All right, let's kick it off.
The good thing about discussing when there's a lot of experience to share from is that those perspectives, there are a lot of different pathways when we work with people and organizations. What I focus a lot on is trying to make the difficult stuff tangible. So
you do it really well.
Mobilize. Thank you. But really try to mobilize the leaders, give them a language. And I know that sometimes we cut out some of the nuances and so on. But if we can leave leaders with something that is so approachable that they can take it to their people and together with them move towards shared leadership rather than it's the leader who leads, then you open up a different way of mobilizing an organization. And with the level of knowledge workers we have today, with the transparency and access to knowledge, with the pressure on the workforces, with the new generations coming into the workplace, we need to see a shift in leadership towards shared leadership, which means we need leaders who can address things that are more difficult to address and involve people in discussing that. And that's where the peer cycle comes in. You don't lose control. On the contrary, you create the commitment, which is a different way of controlling. So rather than trying to be that Christmas tree where everything goes over the star, right? Everything needs to go over the leader. That doesn't work. So we need to shift that into the organization. So that's where I'm coming from. That's
Well, and culture is an unobtrusive form of control. Which is why it's so important. Like, you have to make sure that you have the culture and the behaviors that you want, because when you have a strong culture at every level, it will be reinforced. And so you better be good with what you have. And it really takes a lot of the burden off of management to have a strong culture, because it's a self-correcting system at that point. I don't think most people look at it that way. At least in the US, I feel like there's always a little bit of a battle with having people feel like as soon as you say culture, you're talking kumbaya. Yeah. And like the implications for performance and therefore the bottom line, but also like coordination and just employee well-being and retention, because people like to be in environments where they can predict how they should behave and that they will wind up getting the benefits of that. Like, all of these things are around culture. And but I think that for the most part, we don't think about just how much of the weight of the control mechanism that managers are responsible for is actually shifted onto a good functional culture. And I agree. That's a blessing.
Yeah, and you can say that it came out very, very clearly in the research that there are there are subcultures that are directly related to the 4 organizational intentions that we find in all organizations in varying degree. The first is purpose. So if purpose is strong, then it needs to be supported by a strong purpose culture. Efficiency and stability, so high yield production with high quality and so on, that requires a focus and ambition culture. It requires a discipline culture. It requires a strong safety culture. Mm-hmm. If you want innovation, you need an innovation culture. You need a continuous learning culture. You need a change culture, which means that you've got a high adaptability in the organization. And the last one, which is about our people focus in the strategy and the intentions, that needs to be translated into a strong collaboration culture, empowerment culture, and voice culture. And when you start understanding those links, all of a sudden we see that a shift in the strategy requires work with the culture. So there's no doubt that if you don't work with the culture, and if you got the mindset that culture is something that's there and we inherit it and we can't do anything about it, that victimizing is really an assumption that underpins a lot of people when they talk about company culture. You can't change that. It's, oh, yes, you can. There's a lot of things you can do to change that. And that's basically the core, because that's one discipline in contextual leadership, where the other one is to adapt your leadership to fit the context you are in. And a lot of the cultural research has stood still in these areas, but there are a lot of research, for example, in safety culture, that clearly warrants that you can absolutely strengthen the culture through deliberate interventions. And that's the research that the book taps into and displays clear examples of, how do you strengthen those cultural components to drive your intentions. Mm-hmm.
And I think that to some degree, that's, part what you said with like the mindset that you just inherit the culture. I do think it carries a lot of the weight. Like when it's done well and you have the culture you want, it has a huge control component that takes a pretty big burden. I mean, if you think about the jobs of a manager, one of the main tasks is control, and culture takes a lot of that burden from them. Not all, but a lot. And so that is true, but it is also true that if like the organization is changing over time as it needs to, and you're not paying attention to the ways that that's impacting the culture, your culture basically erodes, and you get subcultures and splinters and, people who just basically are like, okay, whatever, nothing's enforced. Like you say that's the culture, but I never see the impact of it. And so, so they disengage. And that's one way that you have to pay attention as a manager to culture. Everything is integrated into like this tight web. And as soon as anything is cut, that has an impact on basically facilitating the culture. And
I agree.
And we don't, we have full-time jobs. Leaders have full-time jobs. They're not paying attention to it a lot of the time until it's gone far enough out of alignment where it's causing a problem.
So I agree. And there are two drivers here that you touched on. And one is that, so you can be in the situation that you have a weak culture, which, it's not really coherent. People are doing different things. So you've got a weak culture that's not really supporting what you want to happen. You can also have a strong culture that's not fit for purpose anymore.
Right.
Because of it's skewing off, or it's keeping its path dependence.
I think that's the harder one, because that's a strong culture.
That's the harder one, right? Yeah. Because that maintains a course and you're trying to go this way. So if you're not very, very deliberate as a leader. So over here, we need to build a coherent culture, rallying around supporting the components in the culture we want to support, empowerment or safety or fairness or voice or whatever it is. And over here, the thing is that it's very difficult to change a culture if you're not replacing the core components with a new focus. So that means that if you come into an organization that talk about they've got an unhealthy culture, or they want a culture that will change, sometimes they focus a lot on the dysfunctional parts of the culture. And the question is always, what are the cultural components that you want to strengthen so we can pull our way in the right direction? Because that means that we can start committing people not on what they should stop doing,
but what they should start doing,
them on a future that they need to be part of creating.
Right.
And once we get that movement, then we can start rooting out behavior that we don't want. And sometimes the misconduct gets all the attention. So
yeah, it is interesting. It's irritating, right? So that's why it's getting all the attention. Here's what it reminds me of. In the 80s, went through the Reagan era, right? And so the Just Say No to Drugs. And they spent a huge amount of money. I think even back then it was in the billions of dollars to go for this war on drugs and the Just Say No program. And what it ultimately did was increase drug use. And that's because, and I lived through this, and it's because it literally made everybody of that generation feel like everybody around them was doing drugs. And so to me, I just felt very isolated because I'm like, well, I'm out here and I got like maybe a couple of friends and we're not doing this, but everybody else is. It's social proof. And so other people are like, well, everybody's doing it and they seem okay. So sure, I'm going to try it. Right.
Yes.
And so it actually had the opposite impact that they wanted. And they spent a fortune on that. And it was because they focused on the negative. Whereas you fast forward to today, and we are the alcohol industry is in somewhat of a crisis because like the Gallup just had a poll. I think it was like 54% of the younger generation, I'm assuming it's Gen Z that they were measuring in this case, is abstaining from alcohol, which is the highest percent of any generation since they've probably been doing these surveys. And in more important, because it's not a huge discrepancy, I think, I think millennials were like maybe 50. Like there's not a huge percentage difference. I mean, it does matter over the course of 330 million people. But but the big thing was that the 48% or whatever it is that is drinking, they're drinking 50% less. And so like you go into alcohol stores and in some cases half the store is actually alcohol alternatives. Yeah. And that's become the shift because they're trying to figure out still how to make money. But here's the difference. We didn't focus on drinking as the problem like we did in the 80s. We focused instead on health, like just feeling good, looking good. And I think that has naturally driven then to this younger generation not picking up the bad habits.
Yeah, I think the analogy holds up because what we want to do is that it goes for personal development and it goes for organizational development. I don't know a lot about society, but the analogy is absolutely valid for the mechanism that if you want people to develop and you create an idea, a vision, a perception of a desired future state, then we can have a rather direct talk and arrive at rather direct commitments and make good agreements that we can hold each other accountable to because it's about the future. There is no justification. There's no judgment. But there is an aspiration that we want to go there. Whereas if we focus on what we want to fix,
there's definitely judgment.
You get judgment. Yeah. You get justification. You get a lot of psychological defense mechanisms, which are natural. Yeah. But and culture, there's no culture without people. So if we don't work with this in the right manner, that's also why that if we look at the old perceptions of culture, and I'm not throwing a Shine or anyone else under the bus, but what I'm saying is that that's very observational. This is how culture is. And what you find in climate research, the last decades of climate research, and which is the foundation for the book and the approach and the work that I do, is that we need to talk about what we want to do with the culture in an organization. So let's talk about what we want to do with it, how it should be, why we want to go there, so we can add sense making, so we can talk about what does it require from us, so people can be empowered, feel the self-efficacy building because they contribute to bringing us there. And that shift is related to positive psychology and a lot of other stuff, but it works. And that's basically, for me as a practitioner, that's the most important, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. We should probably close up shop, but I want to give you a chance to sort of have like last thoughts.
So the thing that I can see visiting the organizations that I do, and that means that it is based on my experience and the research I've done, is that we do need leaders in general to move further towards shared leadership. We are facing big shifts in the way technology influences work life, in the way we as humans relate to each other, in the way that the new generations expect leadership and work life and relating to be. And we also see in many markets that we need people to stay longer in the workforce, that we need higher and higher levels of knowledge and specialism to create the value for the next generations. We've got some huge problems we need to solve in the world in order to leave a planet for our kids and grandkids that can survive and can thrive. And all of that comes back to the leadership expectations, where in the past, many have seen the leader as the hero, as the center of the value creation and the team and the organization. And we need to shift that and empower the organizations to new levels, share the decisions, create new ways of coordinating value creation. So we've seen the matrix organization as one answer to that. But a core component in the matrix and in building strong cultures, in being contextually effective, is a shift from directing to sharing leadership and building that, weaving that into the fabric of the organization. So if I could have one wish, it was that we as leaders lean much more into that, recognize that, and really work actively with our people, mobilize our organizations to do that.
So a couple of thoughts on that. In one way, I could argue that AI is facilitating that need and shift. And in the other way, I could argue that AI would make it less necessary. But first, when you say shift from being the center to sharing the decision-making, and I don't disagree with that, but when I have seen people take on new roles where they have to give up things that used to make them feel valuable, they have a really hard time with that until they can figure out where the value is in the new role.
Exactly.
And so if we are leaders who are at the center of making decisions, and that's where our value is, and that's historically been, that's our role.
Yeah.
Then when we share that, what becomes our value as a leader?
So there's no doubt that if we do not understand that if we shift role requirements for leaders, we need to think about what is the new role requirement that replaces the value creation, my self-perception of my role in the organization.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not the key question.
Okay,
the key question here is that we have leaders in an organization for a reason. And that reason is to optimize the value creation that the organization can do for some beneficiary, for the society, for customers, for citizens. So there is someone in the receiving end of any company. And of course, it's easier if you're in a company that has a strong core purpose than if you're in a company that doesn't have that strong a core purpose. So that means that the meaning for me as a leader needs to relate to what we're trying to do as an organization. And then within that frame, I need to build things that make me feel worthwhile and build my perception of my value in the organization. And when you start looking at it like that, then we can start looking at what is it that I make other people do? What is it that I make teams do? So we need to create a shift in the perception of that leader role. So it's not a one size fits all and then we're there, but it is really a shift. Why do you become a leader? Well, I was good at something, then I was promoted, and then I found out that feels good in some way. But we need to go into that dialogue. What is it to be a leader? What is the value creation? What is your responsibility for the relations in the organization, for the engagement of your employees, for the decisions and results that they make? And then we need to remember that a vast amount of leaders are functional leaders that are also individual contributors. So in that mix, there is still an individual contribution to R&D or operational planning or sales that they can basically still have as part of their job. And then they've got the leadership role on the side of that. So we need to understand that very few leaders are only leaders, full-time leaders. They also have other components that are value creating in their role requirements. There's not one simple answer to it, Cindi, but I think that shift is necessary also to get the new talents on board and to keep them.
Yeah. I think also the challenge is, so Janet Dukeridge was my advisor, and she wrote a paper a long time ago, with the romance of leadership. And one of my favorite papers she wrote, actually, because especially in this environment, because I see it so often, we have an image in our head of what leadership is. And going back to culture, it's often widely shared. And so what you're proposing also requires a shift in what that schema for what a leader looks like. That has to change. The image in our head of what a good leader, and honestly, it has to change anyway, because it's right now a pretty poor image of leadership. But in the grand scheme of things, we need to start shining a light on the people who are leaders in the ways in which we're going to have to evolve in order to probably get that. It probably contributes to leaders being able to make the shift that you're suggesting that they make. And there probably are some. In fact, I know there are some that are publicly visible.
But I think there is a significant shift in what we're talking about here. We've seen it in the research, and we also see it in organizations. And that is that we stop talking about leaders and we start talking about leadership. And that means that when we do that, we'll find out that a lot of specialists, senior specialists, are exercising a lot of leadership in their projects, in their cross-functional development initiatives. We've got process owners, global process owners in large-scale companies that have to make that process work across a large-scale organization. So they exercise leadership. They're not leaders per se.
Right.
But
they're informal leaders, right?
Exactly. And that means that we need to talk about leadership. And in almost any job, there is leadership, which rhymes a lot to ownership, right? So that the continuum where we have empowerment in one end, ownership and then we go towards shared leadership, and then we move towards more directive leadership. And we need to shift, because if we do not, what we will miss out on is a lot of value creation and a lot of human engagement and thriving and being enriched in your job and fulfilling your potential. So we'll miss out on a lot. And just a remark on the AI.
Yeah,
I think that we'll see a phase where AI makes us less reflexive, and then it will bounce back and find its place so that it adds to our reflexivity. But I do believe that some of the research that's out right now that AI is making us less reflexive is a danger. No doubt about that. So you need to use it right in leadership and in every other sense.
For sure. I agree with that. I was thinking that the role of AI is actually, I could argue that it's pushing towards what you're talking about, because a lot now with AI and a lot of the tools that have been generated, the lower skill, lower knowledge jobs, and I know ChatGPT passed the bar and that's not a low level knowledge job, but generally speaking, the jobs that are immediately at risk are the jobs that are lower knowledge management, right? Probably
jobs.
Not too far in the future, all driving is going to be autonomous.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a whole lot of jobs that have been wiped out. And so one of the implications of AI may be that essentially if you are going to have a job, you're getting pushed into being a knowledge worker, because knowledge workers, they got the stuff in their head. They're not going to be directed. Like, they're the expert. You have to convince them that they want to take what's in their head and apply to the organization, because they don't, we can't force it out of them. Nope. And so in that sense, it is pulling us towards what you're saying, which is a flatter organization where we share decision-making instead of having it centralized and directed. So I can see that element of the AI happening. And so anyway, that was one of the thoughts that kind of triggered. So it's happening. I think you're right. I think it's happening already. And the technology disruption is probably going to be a large part of the reason why it occurs. And I think that's going to happen across the board.
Yeah, but I think that we also see trends that intimacy and localization and human connection is a value driver. So I agree, but I do believe that we will see large scale shifts like you talk about with the drivers. We will also see new jobs emerging.
Yeah. But there'll be knowledge.
And you will see value creation, saying people who are engaged now in transactional work, transactional knowledge work, processing numbers or letters, they will optimize their way of working, allowing a different kind of value creation. So there will always be an optimization, efficiency gain, and then there is a value creation development. And those shifts are happening very fast right now. So we're not replacing right now all of the shifts fast enough with new value creation. So I think that's one of the challenges.
I don't know how you would actually balance that. That would be a miracle of, landing the plane without an engine and no wheels and maybe one wing. I mean, that would really be remarkable if we could.
We'll get together and then we'll figure it out, and then we'll have a very interesting episode on how do we solve the world's problems.
Exactly. But I do think you're right. It's good times. It's going to be full of change. But there's all, it's like any of the change. It's scary at the start because you don't know all the ways that it will impact everything. Clearly, it's going to impact everything.
I agree.
But usually, like, again, like we're co-evolving, and our systems and people need to be able to survive. And so this is going to have to evolve in a way that still allows for human beings to live. Putting Terminator aside.
I truly believe it will, because we've seen it in the development of humanity, that we've had large-scale shifts. We have never faced that where we haven't been talking about, this is unprecedented. It's totally going to change the world. And it is, no doubt about that. We will also see some bad examples. We've seen that every time we've gotten new technology breakthroughs. And I do believe that from a leadership perspective, we need to understand and try to embrace some of the upsides and be wary of not trying to use it for something it should not be used for. But I think that we need to be part of the development. That's also why, what's the purpose of the book? The purpose of the book is to improve leadership. So converting it into a bot makes it more accessible. Is that cannibalizing the book? I don't care, because my mission is to improve leadership. I took the book and started developing what's called CLI. That's the one that's at the bottom behind me, which is contextual leadership AI bot. It's the book and the research behind the book. And there is a tool, a validated tool to measure leadership context that was developed after I did the doctorate. And behind that, there is a report generator that spits out a report, 16 pages with advice on what are you going to do if your context is like that and where's the misalignment. That's also fed into the bot. So that means that what we've experienced now, we've been working with the bot for a little over a year now, is that if you have a leadership team, 3, 4, 5 people, you help them introduce the bot. Then before they tee up the organizations about how are we going to realign so that we can empower the organization more, or get more discipline, or get more throughput, or reduce the number of accidents we have by increasing the safety culture, or whatever component they find, what should we do something about? They have an individual session with client, 5-10 minutes as the start of the meeting. Then they close computers and then they start the discussions. That bumps up their start knowledge about what could be addressed, what could be the levers, how could we approach this? And that has turned out to be a very, very powerful way of infusing knowledge that really qualifies the discussion.
That's really interesting. You'd mentioned that in one of our previous conversations that you'd been working on a bot, but I like the application.
You can never take the human factor out of it. So, but it might take you, lift your solutions 10, 15%. And that's a lot when we look at the organizational measures.
You much lower percent is still worth it. I mean, anything that helps speed you up in terms of figuring out what's going on. Yeah, I mean, and then if it can guide you into like what you have to focus on, I mean, like that's a major helpful tool. Yeah, that's really, I like it.
So I think that you need to go along and be wary that we don't, fall into the ditches, but try to co-evolve with what is happening.
Awesome. Thank you, Torben. Thanks for joining me today. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And how can people find you, Torben? Let's give you a plug here.
Well, you can find me. The easiest way is to go to thecontextualleader.com. That's the homepage of the book. Here you can also find the AI bot and more about the research and so on.
It'll be in the show notes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, but find me on the homepage, and then all my contact data is there.
Awesome. Thanks for joining me today.
Absolutely.
And thanks for joining us today. And we appreciate any likes and so forth, all that stuff, wherever you are. We appreciate anything that helps us raise our visibility. Thank you all. See you next time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today on Management Muse. We are a podcast / YouTube channel that we hope is entertaining and educational. If you are on YouTube, we would appreciate you subscribing and maybe leaving a comment and a like. If you are on any of the podcasts listening to this, we would appreciate stars, following, comments, all the good stuff. We want to say thank you to Sarah and Rebecca. And then just as a last minute reminder, we also want to mention that we are management and communication professionals working in the field, but also have degrees that back us in science. All that being said, we are talking in generalities on this podcast. We do not actually know your particular situation. So proceed with common sense and maybe a little bit of experimentation on your end. And we hope that you make the world a more beautiful place by making work a more enjoyable place. See you next time on Management Muse.